It was called a wedding, but it felt like a funeral. The air that morning hung thick with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke, as if the whole town knew something was about to be buried. Though it still breathed, the bride was young. Far too young, her white dress borrowed from a cousin who refused to be there. Her steps were slow, each one sinking into the muddy path that led to the church. Not a single voice rose to greet her. Only the creak of the old wooden doors and the faint shuffle of boots against warped floorboards dotted inside. The pews were nearly empty. Those who had come sat stiff, eyes fixed on the splintered altar, as if looking anywhere else might invite a curse. And then, there he was, the groom. A man twice her age, with the weathered hands of someone who had worked the fields his whole life, and the same dark eyes she had seen staring down at her crib. Her father died in that moment. Every unspoken rumor, every whispered warning became flesh and blood. He reached for her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers with a grip that was more possession than affection. This was no union of hearts. No blessing from heaven. This was a claim, final and absolute, made in front of God, the town, and the shadows that had long ruled this family's name. And though the bride's face was pale, her lips barely trembling, the look in her eyes said what no one dared. This was not the beginning of a life together. It was the sealing of a fate. The road into Hollow's End is nothing more than a ribbon of cracked dirt and gravel, stretching between fields that have long since stopped growing anything worth harvesting. The wind carries the scent of pine and something older, a damp, earthy rot that seems to rise from the very ground. In its prime, this was a farming town like any other in America. Church on Sundays, harvest in the fall, neighbors who knew every name, every story. But those stories took a darker turn one quiet summer morning, when a man placed a ring on his own daughter's finger. The old-timers still remember the heat. That day, how it clung to the skin like a fever. Some say even the cicadas fell silent when the church bell rang. Word traveled fast, but not fast enough to stop what was about to happen. By the time the handful of townsfolk arrived, the bride was already standing at the altar, her veil trembling in the stale air. Most won't speak of it. A few pretend it never happened at all. But there are records, brittle papers hidden deep in the county archives, and a faded invitation, its edges burned as if someone had tried to destroy the evidence. And there are whispers, passed down in hushed tones at kitchen tables and over back fences. Whispers of a ceremony that crossed every boundary of decency. And bound two lives together in a way that still poisons the town's name to this day. She was born into silence, no laughter in the halls, no music on the radio, just the low creak of the wooden floorboards and the distant hum of wind moving through the fields. Her mother's face is a faint ghost in the few surviving photographs. A young woman with tired eyes, taken before illness stole her breath when the girl was only 6. After that, the father's presence filled every corner of the farmhouse. He was not a man who allowed the world in, and he did not allow her out. She never set foot in a schoolhouse, never had a friend whose name she could write in a diary. Even the postman's occasional knock was met with a locked door and a shadow moving away from the window. The only exception was Sunday morning. They would ride into town in silence, the father's hands tight on the wheel of their rusted truck. In the church, they sat in the very last pew, close enough to the exit to leave without drawing attention. No one remembers ever hearing them sing a hymn. No one remembers them speaking to a soul. As the seasons passed, the girl's reflection in the mirror began to change. Her face took on the softness of youth, turning to womanhood. Her hair grew long and heavy, a pale curtain that she sometimes used to hide behind. But her father's eyes, they changed too. The way he looked at her was no longer the way a father looks at his child. It was something sharper, something heavier, something that made the air in the room feel too thick to breathe. Neighbors, those few who ever caught a glimpse, began to notice the way his hand lingered on her shoulder, or how she avoided eye contact when someone tried to speak to her. Some dismissed it as the awkwardness of isolation. Others quietly wondered if there was something much darker taking root in that lonely farmhouse out in those endless acres of farmland, where the wind could carry a scream away before anyone heard it. The rules of family were being rewritten. She was 16 when the whispers began. They started as faint murmurs in the corner booths of the diner, or outside the hardware store when men leaned against the wall, pretending to smoke longer than they needed to. Someone had seen them walking too close. Someone else claimed they'd overheard him refer to her, not as my daughter, but as my girl. The rumors spread, but never too loudly. Not in Hollow's End, not about a man like him. His temper was a thing of local legend. Sudden, sharp, and without warning. More than one neighbor remembered the sound of his voice carrying across the fields like a thunderclap. And the sight of that double-barreled shotgun resting just inside the screen door. Then came the announcement. No one recalls exactly how it was made. Perhaps it was his gruff voice at the feed store, or a note left on the church bulletin board. But the message was clear. They would be married. It was not a request. It was not a proposal. It was a decree. There was no marriage license on file. No county clerk had signed anything. No pastor agreed to bless the union. And yet, on a cold autumn afternoon, the church bell rang. Only a handful came, a mix of the curious and the cautious. They shuffled into the wooden pews, their boots echoing on the warped floorboards. Dust hung in the air, caught in shafts of pale light filtering through stained glass. When the old church doors creaked open, she stepped inside first. A plain white dress, wrinkled as though it had been pulled from a trunk that morning. In her hands, a bouquet of dead flowers, their petals brown and brittle, trembling as much as her fingers. Behind her came the father, his boots heavy, his chin high. He led her down the aisle not with tenderness, but with the unyielding grip of a man escorting property. There was no sermon, no vows, just the sound of his voice saying, "It's done," as he slid a thin gold band onto her pale finger. A murmur rippled through the small gathering. And then silence. Some said it wasn't a wedding at all. It was a claim. A public warning to anyone who might think to question his authority. And from that day on, she was no longer seen as just his daughter, but as something else entirely. The wedding, if you could call it that, unfolded less like a celebration, and more like a rite. There was no music, no organ, no choir. Only the faint rustle of dry leaves skittering across the church steps outside. Inside, the pews groaned under the weight of uneasy bodies. The air was still, thick, and strangely warm for an autumn afternoon, as though the building itself was holding its breath. The father stood at the pulpit, a crumbling family Bible in his hands. Its leather was cracked, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. He did not read the familiar verses as they had been written. Instead, he replaced the ancient names with his own. And with hers, Abraham became his name. Sarah became hers. Voice was steady, but low, a deep murmur that seemed to stick to the walls. A few of the onlookers claimed later that they couldn't make out the exact words, only the way his lips moved, slow and deliberate, as though he were speaking to something unseen. No vows were exchanged. No promises were made aloud. Instead, when the reading ended, he closed the Bible with a dull thud and simply placed his hand on her shoulder. The gesture was not tender. It was ownership. Those who were there swear the air felt heavier in that moment, as if the room itself were pressing down on their chests. One woman later said she could feel her heart racing, though she didn't know why, only that she wanted to leave before the doors closed again. After the strange ritual, there was no reception. No cake, no laughter spilling out onto the church lawn. The pair walked back to their wagon in silence, her veil catching the wind. his shadow stretching long behind him. From that day forward, the farmhouse became a fortress. Curtains stayed drawn day and night. No visitors came or went. The only sign of life was the faint wisp of smoke from the chimney, and the occasional glimpse of her in the garden, wearing that same white veil dot. It was an image that stuck in the minds of those who saw it. A figure in white, head bowed, hands deep in the soil, moving slowly between rows of wilting plants. The veil fluttered in the breeze, but her face remained hidden. Rumors began to multiply. Some said she wasn't allowed to speak to anyone, not even the postman. Others claimed she had started keeping a small leather-bound notebook, writing in it whenever she thought no one was looking. And then there were the whispers about the lights. A hunter passing by late one night claimed to have seen a flickering glow moving from room to room, not the steady shine of a lamp, but the erratic dance of candlelight. As if someone inside was performing a ritual, the father, when he was seen at all, appeared unchanged, broad-shouldered, weathered, and silent. He would drive into town for supplies, never making small talk, never staying long. And always, without fail, he bought candles. Boxes of them. Over time, the story of that day in the church began to warp. To some, it became less about a father marrying his daughter, and more about an unspoken pact between the two of them, or perhaps between him and something far older, far darker, than the rest of Hollow's End could understand. In the attic of the farmhouse, a single wedding dress, the one she had worn, hung from a bent nail in the rafters. The fabric had yellowed, the hem stained with dirt. It swayed ever so slightly in the drafts that crept through the old boards, like it was waiting, or remembering. The years after the so-called wedding only deepened the strangeness. The girl, now a woman, moved through the world like a shadow tethered to a larger shadow. If she was seen at all, it was beside her father, her posture slightly hunched, her eyes scanning the edges of the street, as though watching for something no one else could see. Her clothing never seemed to change. Long sleeves, high collars, and in colder months, a veil of black lace that clung to her face like a second skin. It wasn't modesty in the traditional sense. It was concealment. One autumn evening, a violent storm rolled through Hollow's End. The rain fell in thick sheets, turning the dirt roads to black rivers of mud. A traveling salesman, unfamiliar with the area, was caught in the downpour. He knocked on the farmhouse door, expecting it to stay shut. To his surprise, the father opened it. Without a word, he stepped aside and motioned for the man to come in. The air inside was warmer than expected, heavy, with the scent of tallow candles and something faintly metallic. The salesman was offered a seat at the kitchen table. The bride, if one could still call her that, moved about the room silently, setting out bread and coffee. She never looked at him directly. When the wind howled harder, rattling the windows in their frames, the father told him he could stay the night in the upstairs bedroom. The offer was accepted with gratitude, and the man climbed the narrow staircase, the boards groaning under each step. He would later say the bed was stiff, the sheets smelling faintly of damp earth. But what woke him hours later was not discomfort. It was sound. At first, it was only a low murmur, like someone talking in another room. Then, as his ears adjusted, he realized it wasn't conversation. It was chanting, a man's voice, deep and rhythmic, punctuated by occasional pauses. Between those pauses came another sound, softer, but somehow more unsettling. The sound of someone kneeling, fabric brushing the floor, the faint intake of breath before whispering something back. He followed the noise to the end of the hallway, where a sliver of candlelight spilled out from a partially closed door. Through that gap, he saw them, the father standing tall, the family Bible in his hands, and the bride kneeling before him in a white veil. Her head was bowed. His free hand rested on her hair. The words he spoke were too low to fully understand. But the cadence was wrong, not the familiar lilt of scripture, But something older. The salesman didn't stay to hear the end. Fear rooted him to the spot just long enough to realize he should not be there at all. He backed away, returning to the bedroom, where he lay rigid until morning. When he came downstairs at first light, the pair was already at the table. Neither mentioned the night before. The bread was fresh, the coffee hot, and yet he could barely swallow. By the time he stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The air was clean, the road a ribbon of wet dirt stretching away into the hills. He never returned to Hollow's End, but his account would trickle into the local taverns, whispered over drinks by those who already suspected more than they dared to say. And so, the picture sharpened. Whatever bound father and daughter together was not just legal defiance or moral decay. It was ritual. It was something that needed witnesses only once. After that night, the townsfolk swore they saw fewer and fewer glimpses of her. When she did appear, her movements were slower, her frame thinner, as though something unseen was hollowing her out from within. Whatever had happened inside that farmhouse was still happening. It happened on a winter night, long after most in Hollow's End had gone to sleep. The old church, the same place where the strange, silent wedding had taken place, was suddenly awash in orange light. A fire, small at first, had begun to crawl along its roofline. By the time the bell began to clang, the townsfolk were already running toward it, buckets in hand, boots crunching over frozen earth. The flames devoured dry timber like paper. The air smelled of pitch and scorched varnish, thick and acrid. But inside, amid the chaos of smoke and heat, was something that stopped them cold. Behind the altar, partially shielded from the flames, was a false panel. It had been pried open by the heat, revealing a small hidden cavity. Inside it were stacks of photographs, dozens of them, tied together with twine, edges curled with age. Someone pulled them out, coughing through the smoke. In the flickering firelight, the images came into view. Every single photograph was of the bride. Some showed her standing stiffly in a long white dress, her hands folded in front of her. Others captured her in plain clothing, head turned just slightly toward the camera. But in every image, without exception, she was beside her father. The earliest photographs were unsettling in one way. She appeared younger, perhaps no older than 14 or 15, but there was a faint smile on her lips. Not joy, exactly, but a softness. In the middle series, the smile had vanished. Her gaze was fixed somewhere beyond the frame, her posture straighter, almost rigid. And then there were the last photographs. In these, the bride's eyes were wrong. Not blurred from damage or poor focus, wrong in a way that made the skin crawl. Glassy, absent, as though the living person inside her had been replaced by something still wearing her skin. Those who handled the photographs swore there was no flash, no staged lighting. And yet, in the later ones, the background seemed unnaturally dark, as if the figures had been lit while the world around them fell into shadow. The townsfolk barely had time to process what they'd found before. The flames took the rest of the church. The roof gave way with a sound like a breaking bone, sending a spray of sparks into the sky. By dawn, all that remained was a skeleton of blackened beams, the air still warm and sharp with the scent of wet ash. The photographs that survived were passed from hand to hand, each person searching the bride's face for clues, for proof that she had been willing, or that she had been trapped. But the more they looked, the less certain they became. One woman claimed that when she stared too long at the last image, the bride's expression seemed to shift, that a trace of a smirk appeared where there had been none before. Others dismissed it as imagination, but the story spread quickly. And then came the detail that no one could explain. In several of the photos, behind the father and daughter, there were faint shapes, too indistinct to be called people, but positioned as though they were standing in attendance. Some were taller, others stooped, their edges blurred as if they were moving at the moment, The shutter clicked. No one in town could recall anyone else being present for those moments. And yet, there they were. The discovery sparked a new theory, one far darker than any whispered before. Perhaps the wedding had not been a singular event. Perhaps it had been repeated. Not in the eyes of the law, but in whatever private ritual bound the two together. The photographs were not keepsakes. They were records. Evidence of some pact renewed again and again, year after year. As her gaze hollowed and her presence faded. By the time the last of the survivors from that night died, the photographs had vanished from town entirely. Some say the father retrieved them before disappearing into the hills. Others believe they were taken by someone else, someone who understood exactly what they were looking at. Whatever the truth, the fire had not destroyed the past. It had exposed it. And in doing so, it had made the shadows in Hollow's End grow just a little longer. The farmhouse is gone now, reduced to cinders in a fire that swept through in the summer of 1974. Officially, the cause was electrical. Unofficially, no one in Hollow's End believed that explanation. What's left today is little more than a scar on the earth, a shallow rectangle of moss-covered foundation stones, and an overgrown path winding through knee-high grass to where the church once stood. The air feels different there, heavier somehow, as though it holds on to something the wind cannot carry away. In the decades since, Hollow's End has become the kind of place hikers stumble into by accident, following a trail that isn't on any map. Most leave before nightfall. Some don't. Those who return tell stories, not in loud voices, but with the strained tone of someone still deciding if they believe what they saw. They speak of a woman, always in white, always moving slowly between the trees, the hem of her dress whispering across dead leaves. Her veil, they say, trails behind her like a pale shadow. It catches the moonlight in a way no fabric should, glowing faintly, even on nights when the sky is dark. And sometimes there's something else, a shape, taller, darker, following close behind. It never steps into full view. Sometimes it's a long shadow between the trees, sometimes just the suggestion of a figure in the fog. Always close, always keeping pace. One hiker, an amateur photographer, claimed he managed to raise his camera in time. The image he brought back was grainy, taken on night vision, but you could make out the faint outline of a woman's figure in the clearing. What unsettled him most wasn't her. It was the smear of black just over her shoulder, as if the darkness itself had taken human form. Locals say the sightings began not long after the farmhouse burned. At first, they thought it was just the land playing tricks, mist and moonlight, mixed with the power of an old story. But then came the disappearances. Over the last 40 years, there have been at least 6 hikers who entered that stretch of woods and never came out. Search teams combed the area, but found nothing except for the occasional scrap of torn fabric, often white, often snagged on a branch. One of those scraps, kept by a retired sheriff, was a piece of fine lace. Delicate, intricate, and scorched along one edge as if it had passed through fire. He keeps it in a drawer now, but admits he sometimes hears it fluttering faintly in the dark, even when the drawer is closed. Some nights, in the right wind, people say you can hear 2 voices in those woods. A woman's whisper and a man's low murmur, weaving together in a language no one recognizes. There's a rumor, unverified, but persistent, that if you follow the sound long enough, it leads you to the old church foundation. There, the ground feels softer underfoot, as if something is buried beneath it. Whether the woman is a ghost, a remnant of memory, or something else entirely, no one agrees. But the shadow that follows her, that's what makes people quicken their steps, because if you stop to watch too long, it stops to. And then it starts moving toward you. The farmhouse is gone now, reduced to cinders in a fire that swept through in the summer of 1974. Officially, the cause was electrical. Unofficially, No one in Hollow's End believed that explanation. What's left today is little more than a scar on the earth, a shallow rectangle of moss-covered foundation stones, and an overgrown path winding through knee-high grass to where the church once stood. The air feels different there, heavier somehow, as though it holds on to something the wind cannot carry away. In the decades since, Hollow's End has become the kind of place hikers stumble into by accident, following a trail that isn't on any map. Most leave before nightfall. Some don't. Those who return tell stories, not in loud voices, but with the strained tone of someone still deciding if they believe what they saw. They speak of a woman, always in white, always moving slowly between the trees, the hem of her dress whispering across dead leaves. Her veil, they say, trails behind her like a pale shadow. It catches the moonlight in a way no fabric should, glowing faintly, even on nights when the sky is dark. And sometimes there's something else, a shape, taller, darker, following close behind. It never steps into full view. Sometimes it's a long shadow between the trees, sometimes just the suggestion of a figure in the fog, always close, always keeping pace. One hiker, an amateur photographer, claimed he managed to raise his camera in time. The image he brought back was grainy, taken on night vision, but you could make out the faint outline of a woman's figure in the clearing. What unsettled him most wasn't her. It was the smear of black just over her shoulder, as if the darkness itself had taken human form. Locals say the sightings began not long after the farmhouse burned. At first, they thought it was just the land playing tricks, mist and moonlight, mixed with the power of an old story. But then came the disappearances. Over the last 40 years, there have been at least 6 hikers who entered that stretch of woods and never came out. Search teams combed the area, but found nothing except for the occasional scrap of torn fabric, often white, often snagged on a branch. One of those scraps, kept by a retired sheriff, was a piece of fine lace, delicate, intricate, and scorched along one edge, as if it had passed through fire. He keeps it in a drawer now, but admits he sometimes hears it fluttering faintly in the dark, even when the drawer is closed. Some nights, in the right wind. People say you can hear 2 voices in those woods, a woman's whisper and a man's low murmur, weaving together in a language no one recognizes. There's a rumor, unverified, but persistent, that if you follow the sound long enough, it leads you to the old church foundation. There, the ground feels softer underfoot, as if something is buried beneath it. Whether the woman is a ghost, a remnant of memory, or something else entirely, no one agrees. But the shadow that follows her, that's what makes people quicken their steps. Because if you stop to watch too long, it stops to. And then it starts moving toward you. For decades, the story of Hollow's End seemed like a closed book, a dark chapter that had burned away with the church and farmhouse. But history has a way of leaving paper trails, even when someone tries to erase them. It happened quietly. A local historian, combing through the county archives for an unrelated project, requested access to a set of ledgers no one had touched in years. Bound in cracked leather, their pages were brittle with age. Their ink faded to a dusty brown. Most of it was mundane: births, deaths, marriages, the kind of everyday record-keeping small towns are built on. But near the back of one ledger, wedged between the entries for 1948 and 1949, something caught his eye: a birth record. The mother's name was the bride. The date, just over 2 years after the so-called wedding, and the father's name was the same man who had walked her down that aisle. The handwriting was deliberate, almost careful. No smudges, no hesitation. As if the person writing it wanted there to be no question of its meaning. The historian turned the page, but found nothing. The next entry began months later, as if time itself had skipped. Between the 2 dates, a single sheet had been torn out. All that remained was the ragged edge along the spine, and the faint imprint of where it had once rested. He checked the surrounding pages for clues. On the one before, faint bleed-through from heavy handwriting suggested someone had pressed down hard, maybe even carved the pen into the paper, but whatever it said was gone. There was no death certificate for the child, no adoption record, no school enrollment. It was as if the boy or girl had vanished from history the moment they were born. Rumors spun quickly. Some claimed the child had died in infancy, hidden away to avoid scandal. Others whispered darker things, that the child still lived, raised in the same shadows that had swallowed the bride. The most unsettling theory, that the child had grown, and still walks among the living. And if the ghostly woman in the woods is the bride, then maybe the shadow following her isn't the father at all. Maybe it's the child. In the years since, a few hikers claim to have seen two figures together in the trees, one draped in white, slow-moving, the other taller. Now, watching, waiting. The historian who found the record doesn't talk about it publicly anymore. He keeps the ledger locked in his office, though he admits he's sometimes heard pages turning when he's alone. On his desk sits a single candle, a habit he picked up. He says, for light in case the power goes out. But he never lets it burn all the way down, because the last time he did, the flame flickered 3 times and died. And in the dark, he swears he heard the faint, far-off toll of a church bell that hasn't existed in over 50 years. If vows can be twisted, if love can be rewritten into something unrecognizable, then how many other weddings hide the same darkness? For every story that surfaces, there are dozens more buried in forgotten towns, sealed in dusty ledgers, whispered in kitchens where the curtains never open. Somewhere, even now, another ceremony may be beginning. The guests will smile, the music will play, and no one will see the shadow standing at the back of the room. Subscribe before the next ceremony begins.